Hello and welcome to the Dashing Swordsman Painting channel. We appreciate you tuning in for the first video. Today we're going to be painting up the plastic sloop kit made by Firelock Games for their Blood and Plunder game. It's part of the Blackbeard versus Maynard 2-player starter kit, and I think also is an individual starter kit that replaced their old resin sloop. This one is assembled as a Balandra Sloop version. It doesn't have that topmost square sail. You can see it doesn't have the spars going across that mast. I actually bought this one as a secondhand used lot from a local game store, which is also the reason that the cannons are already glued in place on the deck, and the mast is glued on. I think if you were going to build this yourself, I would leave the cannons off and the mast separate and then glue those on once the painting is done, just to make manipulating the model a lot easier. First thing, before putting on any paint, go over the model real quick to try and find and remove any leftover mold lines and take those off with a file or a hobby knife. Now, on to priming. You can use any black or brown. If you use brown, it'll even save you a step later. And I'm using an airbrush, but you could just as easily use a rattle can or even hand brush on a primer. The most important thing is to get complete coverage of the model. Don't forget the parts that are hidden underneath or behind the glued on pieces. Next, we're going to put on our first base coat. I'm airbrushing a dark brown here using black and brown from Reaper, but any dark brown that you have will do. Much like priming, good coverage is our main goal here. I'm using an airbrush, but definitely you could hand brush this on too. Remember that thin coats are better than too thick, and you can always put on a second one. If you primed in a brown that you're already happy with, you could consider this step already done. I'm hitting it mostly from the side and above. I'm not as worried about getting underneath all the details like the cannons, because the remaining black anything in there is going to act like a shadow, especially if we're just looking at it from a table distance away. Next, I'm going to add an airbrush of a lighter brown. Here I'm using Reaper's Leather Brown. Because I'm using an airbrush, this is an easy way to get some color variation onto the wood. I mixed in the lighter brown color into the remaining paint in my airbrush cup after I finished the base coat, and then I applied it on from kind of a higher angle on the sides and also onto the more central parts of the deck. My goal was to make it look like the areas that were more exposed to the sun and feet walking around on them might be a little lighter in color. Next, using the lighter brown color and a large dry brush, we're going to bring out the highlights on the wood. Make sure to get most of the paint off the brush and then brush against the grain of the wood. The sculpted details are really going to do you a favor here. Make sure to get the masts on the railings, but don't worry about the cannons and the metal details. We'll paint over those with some opaque coats. I concentrate a little extra on the up-facing and more sun-exposed details, like the cabin entry. If you wanted more color variation, you could even go to a lighter brown or ivory, or even mix in some white with the brown and dry brush over those areas again. Now let's make our all-brown ship a little more interesting with a cool color. I picked red for this ship and applied it on with a flat brush. My thought is that the sailors would be painting this probably while hanging over the side of the ship, so I didn't worry about getting paint into the deepest recesses or even every nook and cranny, just the areas where their brushes would also be getting. I carried this color scheme around the back of the ship and over onto the other side. I used Reaper Dragon Red for this base red. Now, paint the wooden cannon carriages a lighter brown to set them off a little from the wood of the deck. I used Reaper Leather Brown because I like the little orangey brown hue. If your cannons are already glued to the deck, make sure you take your time with a good brush, avoid painting on those beautiful deck highlights you just finished. Or plan ahead and keep the cannons separate, and this will be faster and easier. I also used the same color to paint the wood handle of the tiller. Next, base coat the swivel guns and cannons. I use German gray from Vallejo because it's a dark enough gray that it looks almost black, but still shows a wash in the recesses. You could certainly still use a black, especially since the metallic dry brush we're going to do later will help bring out the details. Again, keeping the cannons separate during the assembly will make this much easier for you, except for the ones hidden under the rear deck. I also applied the same base coat of dark gray to the chain guards, the metal part on the tiller, the hardware on the rudder, the trim around the cabin door and the rear windows, and then to the lamp on the back. We're going to do a wash over the whole ship to get paint down into all the little details and crevices and really bring the ship to life. I'm going to use a dark brown oil wash using Dark Umber from Winsor & Newton that I got in a little multi-pack of basic oil paint colors. I start by putting some odorless mineral spirits in a little container and then adding a dollop of the oil paint and then stirring to mix it as completely as I can. Test it against the side of the container to check the consistency and then add more either paint or spirits if you want. There isn't really a perfect amount and it's kind of just measured with the heart. Once you have it all in solution, just start applying it all over the model. I like to start from the top and work my way down, mostly because I'm lazy. That's where the watery paint is going to flow anyway, and if I go systematically, I don't end up missing a section and having to come back later. A lot of people that I've talked to, even more experienced painters than me, are hesitant to use oil washes. I certainly was, but they're actually really simple, and I think even easier for a job like this than an acrylic wash. Definitely cheaper than coating the ship with a whole pot of Acrax Earthshade. And you have a lot more control with a really long working time. You can blend colors together in different sections. If I wanted to have a particularly black, oily section, I can mix right into it. And best of all, I have the ability to remove any or even all of it to help with color modulation, lightening things up, or even totally removing something that I don't like. All you need is a little bottle of mineral spirits and whatever color of oil paint you want, available at any hobby store. I also keep a dedicated cheap brush for oils, and the only thing I do to clean it after using it is just wipe it on a paper towel. It's been the same one I've used for a couple of years. Once you have the wash everywhere, let it sit for a while, at least 30 minutes to an hour depending on where you live and how fast things dry. I'm lazy, so I let mine get completely dry overnight because I can always remove the oil with the mineral spirits in the next step. This is that magic step in model painting where I think this looks really good. I understand why this is liquid talent. You can see how getting the recesses really brings out the whole wood grain. Take a look over the whole model, see if there's any areas that got missed or anything where the wash pulled away and you need to add more. You can add more oil wash right over the areas you went without worrying about any coffee staining like you might get with an acrylic wash. Time for oil wash magic, highlighting by removal. Get some of the mineral spirits on a little sponge, doesn't have to be soaking, just damp. Start by gently wiping in a test area that's less visible, or like me, smack in the middle of the deck. Less is more, you can always go back and take more off. I'm actually pretty happy with how this turned out. The thin wash settled in the recesses and I can still see the color variation from the dry brush earlier, so I'm not actually taking off very much on this ship, but you can do as much or as little as you want. Keep going around the whole model until you decide that you're done, and then give the mineral spirit some time to dry. Let's set the hatch grates off in color from the rest of the deck. I'm using Rattling Grime contrast paints because I like the warmish tone dark gray, but I think any dark gray or thin black wash like Nuln Oil would do just fine. Apply it evenly all over the hatch grate and then wipe away any spillover. I'm trying to make it look like deep shadow inside the grating. Apply this to both grates and then let it dry completely. We're going to make the lantern look like fancy shiny metal with a metallic dry brush. I'm using bronze from Vallejo because I like the tone of the metal and it'll be different from the cannons. Make sure most of the paint is off of the brush and start gently dry brushing, catching the edges and the raised details. Less is more with each brush stroke and you can always add more pigment. I went for a fairly heavy dry brush overall, trying to give the lantern some cool visual distinction. I'm going to do another highlight with the leather brown, just to bring out some more raised edges that were stained by the wash step earlier. I'm concentrating on the highest and upper areas. I'm also getting the raised grate details to give some contrast from the dark wash underneath. With a lighter red, we're going to use a small dry brush and hit the raised edges of the center of our red panels. I used Reaper's Fresh Blood because it was a good contrast to the dark red underneath. I didn't worry about getting precisely all the way to the edges because I think the color modulation to the center looks pretty good. Next, we're going to bring out the raised details on the guns with a metallic dry brush. This will visually sell the difference in metal material compared with the wood that it's next to. I used lead belcher, but any gunmetal color would work great. I used a smaller brush to keep good control and avoid hitting any of the nearby wood areas. This is my first time rigging up a ship, so I didn't film the fiddling with strings and knots. Check out the rigging guide over on Blood and Pigment for a great explanation. I used a black elastic string to keep tension on the sails and regular black string for the lines between the mast and the hull. I made these sails out of white cardstock because it's sturdier than regular printer paper and I figured less likely to rip with the rigging. The Firelock sail templates are on their website for free and print and cut really easily. I also used a dab of thinned down Elmer's glue on the sail attachment points to try and give them a little extra strength during handling in games. One of these days I'll afford fancy pre-weathered cloth sails, but for now I've got an airbrush and a willingness to fail. I used some light umber ink this time because I know that inks thin down really well and still behave themselves in an airbrush. Make sure to test out the paint on a scrap piece of the same paper to make sure you're not too heavy on pigment and you're not soaking the paper too much. Spray at the edges, give them some staining, maybe do some lines in the middle where it might attach when furled to the mast if you're brave. It seems like the paper's getting too wet with the coats, let it dry and come back for another pass later. Overall, I think the little Balandra Sloop turned out pretty well. I'm happy for my privateers, to go out and capture some definitely legal prizes. Kudos to the sculptors at Firelock for the great details. Also, the Port Royal Kickstarter just happened to launch today. I've definitely already backed it, and I'm looking forward to putting this ship to good use in some of those games. Check it out. Thanks for joining my very first video here on Dashing Swordsman Painting. Feel free to leave any thoughts or suggestions of future painting projects, or any nautical terminology that I may have butchered. See you next time, and happy Summer of Plunder.